The movies lied to you. For decades, Hollywood has sold you an image of gladiators as savage killers who fought to the death in every match, their blood soaking the Colosseum sands while emperors gave thumbs down from golden thrones. But the truth was far more calculated, far more brutal, and infinitely more fascinating than any screenplay could capture. Gladiators were not disposable warriors thrown into arenas to die for entertainment. They were expensive investments, trained athletes worth more alive than dead, celebrities whose names were graffitied on city walls by obsessed fans. Each fighter represented thousands of denarii in training costs, specialized equipment, and dietary regimens designed to build marketable muscle. Killing them was bad business, and Rome understood business. The Colosseum itself was not merely a slaughterhouse, but the most sophisticated propaganda machine ever constructed. Behind its towering walls operated an entire industry of trainers, doctors, managers, and engineers who choreographed spectacles with the precision of modern sporting events. Hydraulic elevators lifted exotic animals from underground catacombs, while tens of thousands of spectators watched battles that were designed to showcase skill, not simply massacre. But what really happened behind those massive iron gates? Why were gladiators more valuable breathing than bleeding? How did Rome transform human suffering into the greatest show on earth? The answers reveal a system built on slavery, economic calculation, and the manipulation of violence as political control. This is not the gladiator story you know. This is the truth Rome tried to bury beneath the sand. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and comment below telling us what city you're watching from. Your support keeps this channel bringing you the untold stories of history. The blood sport that would define an empire did not begin in Rome. Long before the Colosseum rose from Roman soil, before emperors commanded the death of thousands for entertainment, the practice of armed combat as ritual sacrifice belonged to another civilization entirely, the Etruscans. In the shadowed hills of central Italy, between the 8th and 3rd centuries BC, these mysterious people conducted funeral rites that would plant the seeds of Rome's most infamous spectacle. When an Etruscan nobleman died, his passage to the underworld demanded blood. Not animal sacrifice, but human combat performed at the edge of funeral pyres, where flames cast dancing shadows across bound captives and condemned slaves. The Etruscans believed that souls of the departed required propitiation through human blood, that the violence and death of warriors could somehow ease the journey into the afterlife. Fighters were forced into brutal duels beside burning funeral pyres, their weapons crude but lethal, their purpose singular, to die so the dead might rest. These were not entertainment. These were sacred obligations, religious ceremonies where death served a cosmic function. Evidence from Etruscan tomb paintings in Tarquinia and Paestum shows armed figures engaged in combat, though scholars debate whether these depict actual gladiatorial contests or ritual dances. What remains undeniable is the funerary context. These images adorned burial chambers, connecting violence to death rites in ways that would echo through centuries. Rome watched, and Rome learned. In 264 BC, something changed forever. When the Roman politician Lucius Junius Brutus died, his sons decided to honor their father's memory in a way that Rome had never witnessed. They organized a munus, a funeral gift, consisting of 3 pairs of gladiators who fought in the Forum Boarium. The combatants clashed not in private ceremony, but in public view, transforming Etruscan sacred ritual into Roman spectacle. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Romans crowded to witness the bloodshed, transfixed by the display of skill, courage, and mortality performed before their eyes. What the Etruscans had created as religious duty, Rome recognized as something far more valuable: entertainment with profit potential, political capital wrapped in the aesthetics of violence. The transformation accelerated rapidly. By 216 BC, the sons of Aemilius Lepidus presented a munus featuring 22 pairs of gladiators in the Roman Forum. The scale had multiplied. The location had moved to the political heart of the city. What began as tribute to the dead became advertisement for the living. In 65 BC, Julius Caesar elevated the spectacle to unprecedented grandeur. To honor his father, who had been dead for 2 decades, Caesar staged an exhibition of 320 pairs of gladiators clad in gleaming silver armor. This was no longer about funeral rites or religious obligation. This was political theater, a calculated demonstration of wealth, power, and the ability to command life and death on a massive scale. Rome had taken the Etruscan funeral sacrifice and industrialized it, stripping away most of the sacred meaning while retaining just enough religious veneer to legitimize the bloodshed. A slave dressed as Mercury, messenger god who guided souls to the underworld, would deliver the killing blow to fallen gladiators, a theatrical remnant of the practice's spiritual origins. The presence of emperors, priests, and vestal virgins at the games provided a thin religious coating over what had become pure spectacle. The early arenas were improvised affairs, temporary wooden structures erected in forums and public spaces, designed to maximize. The iron gates of the ludus slammed shut behind new arrivals with the finality of a tomb ceiling. These were not schools in any conventional sense. They were factories designed to transform human flesh into profitable weapons, prisons where men learned to kill or be killed under the absolute authority of one man, the lanista. The lanista occupied a position of absolute power within the ludus walls. He was simultaneously owner, trainer, executioner, and businessman, a figure who controlled every aspect of his gladiators' existence from the moment they were purchased or contracted until the day they died in the sand or earned their freedom. Armed with a wooden staff as the symbol of his authority, the lanista made decisions that determined who would live, who would fight, and who would be sold to the highest bidder. His business model was brutally simple. Acquire fighters cheaply through slave markets, prisoner of war auctions, or contracts with desperate freemen, then train them intensively to maximize their value before renting them out to wealthy patrons sponsoring games. The lanista traveled from city to city with his familia gladiatoria, his stable of fighters, offering his warriors to aristocrats and officials eager to impress crowds and advance their political careers. Inside the ludus, rigid hierarchies governed every interaction. The complex was divided into distinct sections: training grounds where sand absorbed blood and sweat, dormitories where fighters slept in cramped cells, punishment areas where disobedience was met with whips and shackles, and administrative quarters where the lanista calculated profits and losses measured in human lives. New recruits, the novici, entered at the bottom of this hierarchy. Whether enslaved prisoners, condemned criminals, or freemen who had signed the auctoramentum contract, they immediately surrendered their autonomy. The contract was explicit and unforgiving. Gladiators agreed to be burned, bound, beaten, and killed by iron if they failed to obey. Free volunteers who signed received payment and kept a portion of fight winnings, but they became property nonetheless, bound by law to fulfill their term or die trying. Upon entering the ludus, each fighter was branded or tattooed with marks of ownership. These inscriptions, burned into flesh, declared in Latin script exactly who owned them, a permanent reminder that they were investments, not individuals. Guards patrolled constantly, ensuring no one escaped the compound. Some ludus kept fighters in cages between training sessions, displaying them to wealthy patrons at feasts like exotic animals. The doctors, veteran gladiators too old or injured to fight, but too valuable to discard, took charge of actual training. These former champions understood arena combat from brutal experience, and they drilled their students with relentless intensity. Training consumed 6 hours daily for experienced fighters, but could extend to 10 hours for novici in their first years. Every morning began with conditioning, running, jumping, strength exercises designed to build the muscular physique that audiences demanded. Then came weapons training against wooden poles called palas, where fighters practiced strikes, blocks, and footwork until movements became reflexive. The doctors worked students to their physical limits using identical exercises repeated day after day, seeking to create automatic responses that could save lives in the chaos of combat. Each gladiator trained in a specific fighting style, determined by the lanista based on physical attributes and market demand. The weapons they used in practice were often heavier than arena versions, building strength while reducing injury risk during training. Sparring sessions allowed fighters to test techniques against living opponents, learning to anticipate movements and strategize under pressure. But perhaps most surprising was the gladiator diet, a carefully calculated regimen that shocked modern archaeologists when they analyzed gladiator bones. These warriors did not feast on meat, as Hollywood suggested. Instead, they consumed primarily barley and beans, a carbohydrate-heavy vegetarian diet that packed on subcutaneous fat. This layer of fat served dual purposes. It provided energy reserves for grueling matches, while creating a protective cushion that made wounds appear more dramatic without penetrating to vital organs. Blood and fat created spectacular visual effects that thrilled crowds, while allowing expensive fighters to survive and fight again. The economic logic was inescapable. A trained gladiator represented an investment of thousands of denarii in purchase price, equipment, training, medical care, and dietary expenses. Killing them unnecessarily destroyed capital. The lanista's profit depended on renting healthy, spectacular fighters repeatedly, not sacrificing them in every match. Discipline within the ludus was absolute and violent. Any disobedience was considered an affront to the lanista's authority and resulted in punishment designed to be memorable: floggings, time in underground cells, reduced rations, or assignments to suicidal matchups. The system demanded complete submission, breaking spirits while hardening bodies. Yet within this brutal machinery, a strange reality emerged. Successful gladiators could achieve a status. Rome did not simply throw men into arenas to kill each other in chaotic brawls. The empire engineered over 30 distinct gladiator types, each with specialized weapons, armor, and fighting styles deliberately designed to create strategic matchups that transformed bloodshed into theater. These were not random warriors. They were carefully crafted archetypes in a lethal chess game where every piece had specific strengths and vulnerabilities. The Murmillo was Rome's tank, the heavily armored powerhouse whose name derived from the fish, murmur, sculpted onto his helmet. He carried the gladius, the iconic short sword of Roman legions, and wielded a massive rectangular scutum shield that could protect his entire body. With armor plating on his sword arm and left leg, the Murmillo advanced like a wall of bronze and steel, using weight and defensive superiority to overpower opponents through attrition. But his heavy equipment made him slow, vulnerable to faster fighters who could exploit his limited mobility. Against him stood the Thraex, named for the warriors of Thrace and built for speed and precision. He fought with the Seeker, a wickedly curved blade that could hook around shields and find flesh where straight swords failed. His smaller square shield offered less protection but greater maneuverability. Metal greaves protected his legs, and his distinctive helmet bore a griffin crest that made him instantly recognizable in the arena. The Thraex used agility and technique, dancing around heavier opponents, seeking openings with slashing attacks that capitalized on the Seeker's unique geometry. The most visually distinctive gladiator was the retiarius, the net fighter who entered the arena nearly naked, without helmet or shield. He carried a weighted fishing net to entangle opponents and a three-pronged trident for lethal strikes at distance. On his left shoulder sat the gallerus, a curved bronze plate that protected against downward sword strikes. The retiarius fought with hit-and-run tactics, using the net's range to control space while avoiding close combat where his lack of armor became fatal. If he lost his net, he wielded the trident two-handed like a spear, keeping opponents at bay through reach advantage. Rome created the secutor specifically to hunt the retiarius, also called contra retiarius, against the net fighter. The secutor wore a smooth, egg-shaped helmet with minimal openings to prevent the net from snagging. Heavy armor protected his body, and he carried a gladius and large shield, forcing close-quarters combat where the lightly armored retiarius became vulnerable. The matchup was calculated theater: mobility versus armor, range versus pressure, fisherman versus fish, in a contest designed to showcase contrasting tactical philosophies. The Hoplomachus paid homage to Greek hoplite warriors, entering the arena with a throwing spear that could engage enemies at distance, before transitioning to a short sword or dagger for melee combat. He carried only a small circular shield, relying on his spear's range and versatile weaponry to control fights. His helmet bore distinctive plumes, and his armor balanced protection with mobility, making him adaptable across different combat scenarios. The Dimacharius remains one of history's most mysterious fighters, a dual-wielding specialist who fought with two swords simultaneously and almost no defensive equipment. Historical records provide few details about his opponents or techniques, but the use of paired weapons suggests exceptional training and coordination. Scholars believe Dimachari represented elite fighters, their aggressive style requiring extraordinary skill to survive without shields. Lower in the gladiatorial hierarchy fought the bestiarii, animal fighters who battled exotic creatures imported from across the empire. Armed primarily with spears, they faced lions, tigers, bears, and other predators in contests that served as warm-up entertainment before the main gladiatorial bouts. The bestiarii occupied a different social category than traditional gladiators, often drawn from condemned criminals who had no chance of earning glory or freedom. The equites brought cavalry warfare into the arena, fighting mounted on horseback with lances and circular shields. They engaged other mounted fighters in choreographed charges and wheeling maneuvers that recreated battlefield tactics in miniature. Some matches featured multiple equites operating as coordinated units, displaying military discipline transformed into entertainment. Even stranger were the andabatai, gladiators who fought completely blind, their helmets sealed without eye holes. Clad in heavy armor but carrying no shields, they stumbled and swung wildly, often fighting while mounted on horses in spectacles designed for comedic value rather than martial display. They occupied the arena's lowest tier, providing slapstick violence between more prestigious matches. Each gladiator type existed not in isolation, but as part of a deliberate system. Mamilos fought Thraex, Retiarius versus Secutor, Hoplomachus against Mamilio, matchups engineered to ensure balanced contests where neither side held overwhelming advantage. The pairings created natural drama: heavy armor against speed, reach versus close combat, defense versus aggression. This was strategic combat, not mindless slaughter. Fights followed rules enforced by referees who monitored techniques and awarded points for skillful strikes. The goal was spectacle, demonstrating courage, technique, and adaptability under pressure. Death could and did occur, but it was consequence rather than objective. Killing an opponent quickly ended the show and destroyed valuable property. Audiences wanted extended contests showcasing the distinct fighting philosophies each gladiator type. The gates of the ludus drew three types of men: slaves purchased like livestock, criminals condemned to death by the sword, and the most shocking category of all, volunteers who signed their lives away for money and a chance at immortality. Roman society was scandalized by the existence of octorati, free citizens who willingly surrendered their legal rights and social status to become gladiators. Yet they came by the thousands, driven by poverty, gambling debts, the seductive promise of glory, or simply the raw thrill of combat. Most gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war captured during Rome's endless conquests, or men purchased specifically for arena training. They had no choice, no voice, no legal personhood beyond their status as property, but the volunteers complicated Rome's moral calculations. These were men who chose slavery, who signed contracts swearing to endure being burned, bound, beaten and killed by iron. Some were ruined aristocrats seeking to rebuild their fortunes through arena winnings. Others were soldiers addicted to battle who couldn't adapt to civilian life. A few were simply young men, hungry for fame, in a society obsessed with martial glory. The Octramentum contract they signed was explicit. You forfeit your citizenship rights, you become property of your lanista, and you agree to die if ordered. In exchange, volunteers received signing bonuses and a percentage of their fight earnings. Successful gladiators could earn substantial sums, enough to buy their freedom, support families, or retire wealthy if they survived long enough. But the contract typically bound them for 5 years minimum, and most never lived to complete their terms. What shocked respectable Romans most was not that men fought for money, but that gladiators became celebrities whose fame rivaled senators and generals. The greatest fighters achieved a status that transcended their legal slavery, becoming household names whose images appeared on pottery, lamps, and walls throughout the empire. Archaeologists have uncovered mosaics depicting named gladiators in intricate detail. Astyanax, Calendio, Barto, warriors whose exploits made them legends. Pompeii's preserved walls tell the story most vividly. Graffiti scratched and painted across the ancient city immortalized gladiators with the fervor of modern sports fans. Celadus the Thraex, the heartthrob of the girls, declared one inscription. Crescens the Retiarius holds the hearts of all the girls, boasted another. Women of all social classes became obsessed with these warriors, attending their training sessions, sending gifts to their cells, even paying for private encounters. The sexual dimension of gladiator fame was undeniable and scandalous. Despite their legal status as slaves and infames, citizens stripped of honor, gladiators were considered devastatingly attractive. Their muscular bodies, scars, and proximity to death created an erotic mystique that overwhelmed social taboo. Wealthy matrons risked reputation and marriage to pursue affairs with famous fighters. Some gladiators fathered children with elite Roman women, creating legal nightmares that tested Roman property law. Successful gladiators attracted patrons, wealthy sponsors who provided equipment, training funds, and living stipends in exchange for association with a winner. These relationships mirrored modern athlete endorsements, with patrons gaining social capital from their gladiators' victories. The most famous fighters accumulated multiple patrons, creating networks of wealthy supporters who competed to fund their careers. Gladiatorial merchandise existed in forms that would be recognizable today. Pottery makers created cups and bowls, decorated with famous fighters' images and fight records. Oil lamps bore gladiator motifs that lit thousands of Roman homes. Even children's toys featured miniature gladiators. Though gladiators themselves received no commission from these depictions, the concept of image rights didn't exist. The phenomenon demonstrated their cultural penetration. Fight promoters advertised upcoming matches with painted posters listing featured gladiators by name, their records and fighting styles. These advertisements functioned like modern boxing promotional materials, building anticipation by highlighting champion matchups and dramatic storylines. The best gladiators became draws, who could guarantee massive attendance regardless of their opponents. But beneath the fame and fortune lived men who understood they were one mistake from death. Every morning they woke in the ludus. They calculated whether this would be the day they entered the arena for the last time. The psychological toll was immense. Warriors who trained together for years, who shared meals and quarters, were forced to fight each other, knowing only one might survive. Some formed deep bonds despite their circumstances, swearing oaths of brotherhood that transcended their enslaved status. The contradiction defined their existence. Treated as property yet worshipped as heroes, legally dead yet more alive in public consciousness than most free citizens, slaves who earned more money than many merchants, condemned men who lived in luxury between their possible executions. They occupied a unique space in Roman society, simultaneously its lowest and most celebrated members. Champions who survived multiple years earned privileges unimaginable for typical slaves. They lived in private quarters rather than group cells. They selected their own equipment and training partners. Some accumulated enough wealth to purchase better fighters as their personal bodyguards. A few became trainers themselves, transitioning from warrior to doctor, passing their knowledge to the next generation of condemned men. Yet even the greatest champions lived with the knowledge that popularity was temporary and mortality was certain. Injuries accumulated, reflexes slowed. Younger fighters emerged hungry to claim their fame by defeating legends. The crowd's love was fickle. One disappointing performance could transform a hero into a... The scandal that shook Rome to its foundations wasn't just blood in the sand. It was whose blood was spilling. When women first entered the arena as gladiators, they shattered every assumption Roman society held about gender, honor, and the natural order of civilization. These were the gladiatrices, warriors whose very existence was so controversial that Rome refused to even create a proper word for them. The term gladiatrix is a modern invention. Ancient Romans simply called them ludier or mulieres, performers and women, refusing linguistic acknowledgement of a reality that terrified their patriarchal foundations. They were not supposed to exist. Roman ideology demanded that women embody modesty, obedience, and domestic virtue. The ideal Roman woman managed her household, bore children, and remained invisible in public life. The arena, a space defined by violence, physical dominance, and public spectacle, represented everything forbidden to respectable femininity. Yet despite centuries of social conditioning and legal restrictions, women fought. The first evidence appears in 11 AD, when the Roman Senate passed emergency legislation prohibiting free-born women under age 20 from participating in arena games. The very existence of this law proves that women had been fighting long enough to alarm conservative senators. The decree specifically targeted free women, not slaves, suggesting that both classes were entering the arena and that the sight of Roman citizens willingly degrading themselves as fighters was politically intolerable. The Senate tried again in 19 AD with stricter legislation targeting upper-class women, expanding prohibitions to prevent noble women from disgracing their families. But laws proved ineffective against the lure of the arena. Women continued fighting for decades, drawn by the same motivations that attracted male volunteers: money, fame, independence, and the intoxicating rush of combat. Some gladiatrices were slaves purchased specifically for arena training, human property with no choice in their fate. Others were freed women, former slaves who had won manumission but remained trapped in poverty, turning to the arena as one of the few paths offering financial survival. But the most shocking participants were the noble women who voluntarily entered the ludus, signing contracts that stripped away their social status for a chance at glory their gender normally denied them. For a Roman noblewoman to become a gladiatrix was to commit social suicide. She forfeited all respectability, her reputation destroyed as thoroughly as if she'd become a prostitute. Yet they came anyway, some fleeing arranged marriages, others seeking escape from domestic prisons, a few simply craving the violence and freedom the arena represented. These women understood the price and paid it willingly, trading honor for autonomy in a society that offered women almost no legitimate paths to power. The training they received was inconsistent. Some gladiatrices were daughters or wives of male gladiators who taught them combat basics informally. Others received minimal instruction before being thrown into arena matches, designed more for comedic shock value than serious competition. The satirist Juvenal mockingly described women training with swords, their exertions considered unnatural and ridiculous by male observers. Yet archaeological evidence proves that some gladiatrices were deadly serious professionals. The relief discovered in Bodrum, Turkey, depicts two female fighters, Amazon and Achillea, armed with swords and shields in the style of Murmillo or Samnite gladiators. The inscription above them reads, "Stands misses, an honorable draw, proof that they fought skillfully enough to earn mutual respect rather than death. The relief's existence demonstrates that these women were popular enough to justify expensive commemorative stonework." In London, archaeologists uncovered skeletal remains of a woman, buried with honors, typically reserved for gladiators. Analysis of her bones revealed patterns consistent with repetitive weapon training and physical trauma from combat. She had fought, survived, and been honored in death. The great Dover Street woman stands as physical proof that gladiatresses were not merely theatrical novelties, but trained warriors. Women fought women in the arena, not men. Roman sensibilities wouldn't tolerate mixed-gender combat, but female-only matches drew massive crowds precisely because of their transgressive nature. The shock value was immense. Watching women engage in the violent masculine activity of arena combat created spectacles that combined eroticism, scandal, and violence in ways that fascinated and horrified audiences simultaneously. The crowd reactions were complex. Some spectators treated gladiatresses as comedy, laughing at women attempting men's work. Others became devoted fans, celebrating skilled fighters with the same fervor they showed male champions. Evidence suggests that successful gladiatresses earned fame comparable to their male counterparts, their names inscribed on pottery and walls, their images capturing public imagination. But male Roman writers universally condemned the practice with visceral disgust. They portrayed gladiatresses as unnatural abominations, women who had betrayed their gender and corrupted Roman virtue. These criticisms reveal less about the gladiatresses themselves than about male anxiety over women who claimed traditionally masculine power. Women fighting in the arena represented a challenge to the entire social order. If women could wield swords and command crowds, what else might they claim? Finally, in 200 AD, Emperor Septimius Severus banned all women from arena combat, declaring the practice led to general disrespect toward women. Yet even this imperial decree couldn't completely eliminate gladiatresses. An inscription discovered in Ostia records a magistrate named Hostilianus, who became the first, since the city's founding, to permit women fighters in the Colosseum. Wasn't merely a building. It was the most sophisticated entertainment machine ever constructed, a technological marvel disguised as stone and sand. When Emperor Vespasian began construction in 72 AD on the site of Nero's hated Palace Lake, he was creating more than an arena. He was building the ultimate propaganda weapon, a structure designed to demonstrate Roman engineering supremacy while providing free spectacles that kept 50,000 citizens entertained, distracted, and loyal. The statistics alone staggered the imagination. An elliptical structure measuring 188 meters long by 156 meters wide, rising 48 meters high across 4 levels, equivalent to a modern 15-story building. The outer wall consumed over 100,000 cubic meters of travertine limestone, each block connected with 300 tons of iron clamps. Inside, 80 entrances called vomitoria, places of spewing, allowed the entire crowd to evacuate in less than 10 minutes, a feat of crowd management that modern stadiums still struggle to match. The seating arrangement reflected Roman social hierarchy with brutal precision. The emperor sat in the pulvinar, his private box positioned for optimal viewing, flanked by senators and vestal virgins in marble seats at ground level. Above them sat the equestrian class, then wealthy citizens, then common plebeians. Women, slaves, and the poorest Romans crowded into wooden seats at the very top, farthest from the action, their distance from the arena floor directly proportional to their social insignificance. 4 special entrances were reserved exclusively for elite attendees, ensuring aristocrats never mixed with commoners. But the Colosseum's true genius lay beneath the arena floor, in the Hippodrome, a vast subterranean complex of tunnels, chambers, and machinery that transformed spectacle into industrial efficiency. Originally, the arena floor could be flooded for naumachii, naval battle recreations using scaled-down ships. But Emperor Domitian recognized that permanent theatrical machinery offered more versatility than occasional naval shows. He constructed a 2-level underground labyrinth beneath the wooden arena floor. 32 animal cages lined the hypogeum's corridors, each connected to trap-doors in the arena via vertical shafts. When handlers gave the signal, counterweight systems and winches powered elevators that lifted caged lions, bears, tigers, elephants, and exotic creatures directly into the arena. Spectators watching from above had no idea how animals appeared. They simply materialized through sand-covered trapdoors in moments of theatrical magic that seemed supernatural. The animal logistics alone represented an empire-spanning operation. Rome imported thousands of creatures from Africa, Asia, and distant provinces. Lions from North Africa, tigers from India, bears from Germania, crocodiles from Egypt, elephants from sub-Saharan Africa. At the Colosseum's inauguration in 80 AD, Emperor Titus presented 100 days of games that slaughtered 5,000 animals. The bloodshed was so extensive that some species were hunted to regional extinction to feed Rome's insatiable appetite for exotic death. Gladiators and condemned prisoners waited in cells carved into the hypogeum's stone, listening to the roar of crowds above while preparing for battles they might not survive. Special tunnels connected the underground complex to external gladiatorial schools, allowing fighters to reach the arena without exposure to crowds. The emperor and vestal virgins used private tunnels that delivered them directly to their seats, maintaining separation from common citizens. Above the spectators' heads stretched the velarium, an enormous, retractable awning system that protected audiences from sun and rain. This wasn't simple canvas stretched across poles. It was an engineering masterpiece requiring 240 wooden masts anchored in the Colosseum's upper level, connected by rope systems to 160 external stone posts. The fabric segments were custom cut to fit the elliptical structure, creating a shade system covering 50,000 people. Operating the velarium required 100 specialized sailors from Rome's imperial fleet stationed at Misenum, naval experts who traveled to Rome specifically to manage the complex rigging. In high winds, they had to rapidly retract the entire system to prevent structural collapse that could kill thousands. Events at the Colosseum lasted from dawn until dusk, following a carefully structured program designed to maintain audience engagement through escalating spectacle. Mornings featured venations, animal hunts where bestiari fought lions, bears and bulls in simulated wilderness environments created through props and scenery. Lunch intermission showcased public executions, with condemned criminals torn apart by animals, crucified or burned alive. Theatrical deaths serving as both entertainment and political warning. Afternoon brought the main event, gladiatorial combat. These matches weren't simple bloodbaths, but carefully orchestrated contests between specific fighter types, refereed battles following rules that emphasize skill over slaughter. The crowd witnessed strategic chess matches played with human pieces, where retiari faced secutores, mumillones battled thraces, and champions earned fame through technique rather than body count alone. The most spectacular events required total arena transformations. Forests sprang from the sand as crews installed trees, rocks, and vegetation for elaborate hunt scenarios. Historical battles were restaged with hundreds of participants, complete with authentic uniforms and weapons. During the Colosseum's early decades, engineers flooded the arena for naval battles, filling the space with water deep enough to float small warships in recreations of famous conflicts. All of this was provided free to Roman citizens. The games cost nothing to attend beyond the price of securing good seats early. Emperors and wealthy aristocrats funded the spectacles as political investments, buying loyalty through blood and entertainment in a calculated exchange of violence for popular support. The Colosseum operated as Rome's most effective propaganda machine. The iron gates groaned open and sunlight flooded the tunnel, Beyond lay the arena floor, a vast expanse of sand that would soon be stained with blood, sweat, and the possibility of death. 50,000 voices roared from tiered seats surrounding the combat space, a wall of sound so overwhelming that gladiators claimed it physically pressed against their chests like a living force. This was the moment every fighter trained for and feared in equal measure, the walk into the arena where reputation was forged or destroyed in minutes. The day's events followed a precise choreography designed to build tension toward the afternoon's gladiatorial climax. Before the main fights, gladiators participated in the pompa, a ceremonial procession through the arena where fighters displayed their equipment and physiques to the roaring crowd. They paraded before the emperor's podium and raised their weapons, some sources claiming they shouted, "Ave Imperator, morituri te salutant," "Hail, Emperor, those who are about to die salute you," though historians debate whether this phrase was actually common or merely theatrical invention. Musicians positioned around the arena provided a soundtrack to violence. Horns blared to signal the start of combat. Drums pounded rhythms that matched the fighters' movements. Hydraulic organs, massive water-powered instruments unique to Roman engineering, created haunting melodies that underscored the drama unfolding on the sand. The music wasn't background noise. It was psychological warfare, designed to heighten tension for fighters and spectators alike. Announcers narrated the action, providing commentary that educated crowds about the fighters' backgrounds, records, and fighting styles. These professional narrators, similar to modern sports commentators, built dramatic narratives around each match, transforming violence into storytelling. "Flamma the Syrian, 21 victories, 9 times granted mercy," they might shout, giving context that allowed spectators to appreciate the stakes. Betting consumed the crowd's attention as intensely as the fights themselves. Though officially discouraged, gambling on gladiatorial outcomes was ubiquitous, with bookmakers operating openly in the stands and fortunes changing hands based on who landed the first strike or drew first blood. The betting added another layer of audience investment. Spectators weren't just watching violence, they were financially connected to specific outcomes. Before combat began, an elaborate weapon inspection ritual unfolded. Officials brought gladiators' arms onto the sand and publicly tested each blade's sharpness and each shield's integrity, proving to the audience that the contest would be genuine and not staged with dulled weapons. This transparency was crucial. Romans demanded authentic combat, not theatrical fakery. The fighters then approached each other in the center of the arena. What happened next would shock modern audiences, accustomed to trash talk and psychological intimidation. Gladiators formally greeted their opponents. They clasped arms or touched weapons in acknowledgement of shared experience. Warriors recognizing warriors regardless of which one might soon be dead. This code of honor demanded respect even between mortal enemies, transforming the contest from savage bloodlust into something closer to ritualized duel. The fight itself rarely resembled Hollywood depictions of chaotic sword swinging. 2 referees monitored the action with long staffs, enforcing rules that governed valid strikes, illegal techniques, and boundaries. The combat was technical, strategic, a chess match with lethal pieces where every movement carried calculated risk. Most contests lasted between 10 and 15 minutes, far shorter than modern sporting events, but extraordinarily intense given the physical demands of armor and weapons combined with the psychological pressure of potential death. The crowd wanted skill, not slaughter. They jeered at clumsy fighters who swung wildly without technique. They cheered displays of courage, a Retiarius maintaining composure after losing his net, a Mumilio advancing despite bleeding wounds, combatants who demonstrated the Roman virtues of gravitas and fortitudo under ultimate pressure. The audience was sophisticated enough to recognize superior technique and brave enough to loudly voice displeasure when fighters disappointed. When one gladiator gained decisive advantage, his opponent disarmed, wounded, or exhausted, the fight entered its most dramatic phase. The defeated fighter could request mercy by raising his index finger or laying down his weapons. At this moment, the crowd's voice became judgment itself. If they shouted, "Mite, let him go," the sponsor typically granted mercy. If they roared, "Jugula, execute him," death was imminent. Contrary to Hollywood myth, the thumbs down gesture's meaning remains historically uncertain. Some scholars believe thumb up signaled death, pointing a sword toward the victim, while a hidden thumb represented mercy. Others argue the opposite. What is certain is that the gesture existed and carried absolute authority over life and death. If mercy was denied, the defeated gladiator was expected to display final courage. Trained from their earliest days in the ludus, fighters practiced dying well, kneeling, presenting their neck or throat, accepting the death blow without pleading or struggling. This was the ultimate test of a gladiator's virtue, dying with dignity, even when terror must have flooded every nerve. The victor delivered the fatal strike between the shoulder blades or through the neck. Quick techniques designed to minimize suffering while providing the violent spectacle audiences demanded. Sometimes an attendant dressed as Charon, mythological ferryman of the dead, confirmed death with a hammer blow to the fallen fighter's skull. Another attendant dressed as Mercury touched the body with a heated iron, the most iconic image of ancient Rome. The emperor's thumb pointing downward to condemn a defeated gladiator to death is a complete fabrication. For over a century, Hollywood has burned this false gesture into global consciousness so thoroughly that billions of people know something that never happened. The truth is far more complex, far more uncertain, and reveals how a single 19th century painting rewrote history through the power of dramatic imagination. The phrase that survives in Roman texts is pollis verso, with turned thumb. But ancient writers never specified which direction the thumb turned, what the gesture looked like, or even who performed it. The historical record contains frustrating ambiguity, fragments of descriptions that contradict each other, and artistic depictions too unclear to definitively interpret. What we do know is that the modern understanding is almost certainly wrong. The myth solidified in 1872 when French painter Jean-Léon Gérôme created Pollis Verso, a massive canvas depicting a victorious gladiator standing over his defeated opponent, while spectators thrust their thumbs downward in a unified gesture of condemnation. The painting was a masterpiece of academic art, dramatic lighting, meticulous historical detail in costumes and architecture, and a composition that captured the brutal spectacle of Roman entertainment. It was also historically inaccurate. Gérôme invented the thumbs-down gesture based on his interpretation of fragmentary Latin sources. The painting became wildly popular, reproduced in books and museums across Europe and America. When Hollywood began producing Roman epics in the 20th century, filmmakers used Gérôme's painting as their visual reference, cementing the thumbs-down gesture as historical fact in movies like Spartacus, Gladiator, and countless other productions. Generations grew up believing they were witnessing authentic Roman tradition when they were actually watching 19th century French artistic interpretation. Modern scholarship has systematically demolished the thumbs-down myth. After decades of analyzing Roman texts, artwork, and cultural context, historians have reached a scholarly consensus, though still debated, that the gestures were likely the opposite of what popular culture depicts. The most accepted theory, developed by classicist Anthony Courbet after years of research, proposes that the thumb represented the sword itself, a symbolic weapon whose position indicated the crowd's verdict. To demand death, spectators extended their thumbs upward or outward in a thrusting motion that mimicked a sword strike, sometimes waving the gesture repeatedly to emphasize their bloodlust. This pollis verso movement, the turned or extended thumb, symbolized the blade piercing the defeated fighter's body. Conversely, mercy was signaled by concealing the thumb inside a closed fist, as if sheathing the symbolic sword. This pollex compressus gesture, the compressed thumb, indicated that the blade should remain hidden, that blood should not be spilled. The visual contrast between extended thumbs waving violently versus closed fists held still would be immediately recognizable from across the vast arena, allowing event organizers to quickly gauge crowd sentiment. A medallion discovered in Nîmes, France, provides crucial archaeological evidence. The artifact depicts a gladiatorial scene with a referee, not the crowd or emperor, displaying a downward-pointing thumb gesture while gladiators stand nearby. Courbet's analysis suggests this downward thumb indicated mercy, literally pointing the symbolic sword down into the sand rather than toward the defeated fighter. The image contradicts Hollywood's interpretation entirely. Other theories complicate the picture further. Some scholars argue that pointing the thumb toward one's own chest signaled death, as if the crowd were stabbing themselves in solidarity with the killing blow. Others suggest multiple gestures existed simultaneously, varying by region, era, or even individual arena customs. The lack of definitive evidence means historians continue debating specifics while agreeing on one central point. The modern thumbs down means death convention is almost certainly wrong. What makes the historical confusion worse is that Roman sources rarely describe the gesture in detail because it was so familiar to contemporary audiences that explanation seemed unnecessary. When the poet Juvenal wrote about spectators with verso polis, he assumed readers knew exactly what he meant. 16 centuries later, we're left guessing, reconstructing meaning from contextual clues and fragmentary references. The myth also misrepresents who made the decision. Hollywood depicts emperors personally determining each gladiator's fate with theatrical thumb gestures, but historical reality was more complex. Referees in the arena often made initial judgments. The crowd's collective voice influenced decisions. Event sponsors, not always the emperor, held ultimate authority over life and death since they were paying for the gladiators. The emperor's participation was significant when he attended, but he wasn't personally executing or sparing every defeated fighter. Most importantly, the gesture itself wasn't nearly as common as films suggest. The vast majority of gladiatorial matches didn't end with death sentences requiring crowd judgment. Fighters were too valuable to kill routinely. Many matches concluded with both warriors surviving, with clear victors who didn't require their opponent's deaths, or with draws where both demonstrated sufficient skill to earn continued life. The dramatic life-or-death thumb gesture was the exception, not the rule, reserved for matches where one fighter was so thoroughly defeated that only crowd mercy could save him. The polis verso moment when it did occur must have been terrifying beyond Hollywood's ability to capture. Imagine kneeling in blood-soaked sand, wounds screaming, lungs burning, while 50,000 voices merged into judgment, some extending thumbs in death demands, others concealing thumbs in pleas for mercy. The cacophony of contradictory gestures, the desperate attempt to gauge which side dominated, the final seconds waiting to learn whether you would see tomorrow or die in the next heartbeat. And through all of it, the gesture itself remained ambiguous, uncertain, a movement whose precise meaning we can never fully recover because Romans considered it too obvious to explain in detail, and Hollywood was too confident to admit we don't actually know. In 73 BC, a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus did what Rome believed impossible. He broke the chains that bound him and nearly destroyed the Republic itself. His name would echo through 20 centuries as the ultimate symbol of resistance, the slave who transformed from arena entertainment into Rome's worst nightmare. Spartacus was no ordinary slave. Born in Thrace, he had served as an auxiliary soldier in the Roman army before deserting, an act that condemned him to slavery as punishment. He ended up in Capua, locked inside the ludus of Lentulus Batiatus, trained to kill for the amusement of crowds that would never see him as human. But Spartacus possessed something that terrified his captors: intelligence, combat experience, and natural leadership that could transform oppressed men into an army. The escape began as desperation, not revolution. In 73 BC, Spartacus and 78 fellow gladiators learned that their plan to flee had been discovered. Facing certain execution, they had nothing left to lose. They seized kitchen knives and whatever weapons they could grab, fought their way out of the ludus in a chaotic breakout that left guards dead and Capua in shock. The fugitives fled to Mount Vesuvius, the volcano that would later bury Pompeii, taking refuge in its slopes where they hoped to hide until pursuit ended. Rome sent 3,000 soldiers under Praetor Claudius Glaber to crush what they assumed was a minor slave disturbance. Glaber surrounded Mount Vesuvius, confident that starvation would force the gladiators into submission. It was a fatal miscalculation. Spartacus and his men wove ropes from vines, rappelled down the volcano's rear cliff face in a daring nighttime descent, circled behind the Roman camp, and slaughtered Glaber's forces in a surprise attack that captured all their weapons and armor. The impossible had happened. Slaves had defeated a Roman army. News spread like wildfire through Italy's slave population, estimated at 2 million people, nearly 40% of the peninsula's inhabitants. Thousands abandoned their masters and fled to join Spartacus. Within months, his force swelled to 70,000 fighters, slaves from farms, mines, gladiatorial schools, households, all united by the intoxicating possibility of freedom. Rome sent larger armies. Spartacus destroyed them. Praetor Publius Varinius led fresh legions against the slave army and was so thoroughly defeated that he lost his horse, his armor, and his dignity in panicked flight. The victory was so complete that Spartacus's forces captured Roman battle standards, military equipment, and most humiliatingly, the praetor's ceremonial fasces, the symbols of Roman authority. By late 73 BC, Spartacus commanded an army exceeding 100,000. They weren't a mindless mob. They were organized military force, divided into units with clear command structure. Spartacus trained them using Roman military tactics he'd learned as a soldier, transforming agricultural laborers and domestic servants into disciplined warriors. They devastated southern Italy, sacking cities including Nola, Nuceria, Thurii, and Metapontum with terrible destruction, according to Roman historian Livy. But Spartacus never intended to destroy Rome itself. His goal was escape, to lead his followers north through Italy, cross the Alps, and allow each slave to return to their homeland and live free. It was liberation, not conquest, that drove him. The army began its northern march, a massive column of armed former slaves moving through the Italian countryside like an unstoppable tide. Internal divisions fractured the movement. A faction led by gladiator Crixus broke away, preferring to continue raiding and looting rather than fleeing Italy. Roman forces annihilated Crixus and his 30,000 followers. In response, Spartacus honored his fallen comrade with funeral games, forcing 300 captured Roman prisoners to fight as gladiators until they died, a bitter reversal that transformed Romans into the entertainment they had forced upon slaves. Roman historian Florus noted how Spartacus wiped out his past disgrace by becoming, instead of a gladiator, a promoter of gladiatorial spectacles. Near the Alps, with freedom almost within reach, Spartacus inexplicably turned his army south. Historians debate why. Perhaps he couldn't control his followers who preferred plunder to homeland. Perhaps he hoped to escape by sea to Sicily, or perhaps he realized Rome would never let them leave alive. Whatever the reason, the decision was fatal. Rome finally took the threat seriously. They appointed Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest men and most capable commanders, to end the war. Crassus received 8 legions and authorization to do whatever necessary. He understood that standard tactics had failed and that extreme measures were required. Crassus trapped Spartacus's army in southern Italy by building a massive wall across the peninsula's toe, a fortification stretching 40 miles from sea to sea. For months, the slaves were besieged, supplies dwindling, hope fading. Spartacus attempted to negotiate terms, perhaps safe passage, in exchange for ending the rebellion. Crassus refused every offer. There would be no mercy, no negotiation, only complete annihilation. In 71 BC, Spartacus launched a desperate final assault to break through Roman lines. The battle was apocalyptic, 60,000 slaves against 8 Roman legions in combat so fierce that ancient sources describe the ground as invisible beneath corpses. Spartacus fought with suicidal courage, trying desperately to reach Crassus himself, cutting through Roman soldiers in a doomed attempt to kill the general. He nearly succeeded before being overwhelmed and cut down. His body was never found, lost among the thousands of dead. But 6,000 captured survivors learned that death in battle would have been mercy. Crassus crucified them along the entire length of the Via Appia, the road connecting Capua to Rome, 130 miles lined with crosses. 6,000 died. The end came not with a single blow, but through centuries of slow suffocation. The games that had defined Roman identity for over 600 years died from a combination of moral condemnation, economic collapse, and the rise of a religion that promised salvation instead of spectacle. Christianity, once persecuted in the very arenas where gladiators fought, would ultimately destroy the institution that had killed so many of its early martyrs. For the first 3 centuries after Christ's death, Christians were occasional victims of arena violence, condemned criminals thrown to beasts, or forced to fight gladiators as part of public executions during intermissions between main events. These martyrdoms were real but sporadic. Rome didn't systematically hunt Christians as state policy, but when believers refused to worship Roman gods or acknowledge the emperor's divinity, they faced the damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. The image of Christians being devoured by lions in the Colosseum became legendary, though historians now recognize that while such executions occurred, they were far less common than popular imagination suggests. Early Christian writers condemned the games with visceral disgust. They saw gladiatorial combat as murder disguised as entertainment, a celebration of violence that contradicted everything Christ had taught. The biblical prohibition against killing applied to arena spectacles just as much as to personal violence. Church fathers wrote treatises denouncing Romans who attended games, warning that watching men die for pleasure corrupted the soul and led to damnation. Yet Christianity's relationship with gladiatorial culture was complex. St. Augustine of Hippo, one of the Church's greatest theologians, actually compared the unwavering courage of gladiators facing death to the steadfastness required of Christian martyrs, urging his followers to possess a gladiator spirit when confronting persecution. This uncomfortable parallel revealed a deeper truth. The games celebrated virtues, courage, endurance, acceptance of fate, that Christianity also admired, even as the Church condemned the violent context. Some scholars argue the real reason Christianity opposed the games wasn't humanitarian concern, but competitive theology. Gladiatorial combat staged dramatic performances about dying nobly, about facing mortality with courage, about transcending fear through ritual violence. These were the exact same themes Christianity offered through martyrdom narratives and resurrection promises. The arena and the Church competed for the same emotional and spiritual territory, and only one could win. Christianity remained a minority religion for centuries, but when Emperor Constantine converted in the early 4th century, everything changed. In 313 CE, he issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity and ending persecution. In 325 CE, he took the unprecedented step of attempting to ban gladiatorial games entirely. His edict, directed to governors of eastern provinces, declared that such bloodshed was incompatible with a Christian empire. The ban failed completely. Gladiatorial traditions were too deeply embedded in Roman culture, too popular with masses who had enjoyed free entertainment for generations, too useful for aristocrats who relied on sponsoring games to maintain political influence. Constantine's edict was ignored across most of the empire. The games continued, perhaps with slightly reduced frequency, but fundamentally unchanged. Christianity didn't become the official state religion until 380 CE under the Edict of Thessalonica, decades after Constantine's death. Even then, Christians remained a minority, lacking the critical mass necessary to enforce unpopular bans against beloved traditions. Emperors issued repeated prohibitions, each one evidence that previous attempts had failed. But the economic reality supporting the games was collapsing. By the late 4th century, the Western Roman Empire was disintegrating. Barbarian invasions devastated provinces, cutting off the supply chains that had provided exotic animals, prisoners of war, and the wealth necessary to sponsor extravagant spectacles. Maintaining gladiatorial schools became prohibitively expensive as tax revenue plummeted and military demands consumed whatever resources remained. Emperor Honorius closed the gladiatorial schools in 399 CE, eliminating the training infrastructure that had produced fighters for centuries. 5 years later, in 404 CE, he issued a final comprehensive ban on gladiatorial combat. According to tradition, the catalyst was a dramatic martyrdom. A Christian monk named Telemachus jumped between two fighting gladiators in the Colosseum, attempting to stop the bloodshed. The enraged crowd, spectators who had paid nothing but expected entertainment, stoned the monk to death for ruining their show. Horrified by this murder of a holy man, Honorius formally abolished gladiatorial games across the empire. This time, the ban stuck. Not because Romans had suddenly developed humanitarian sensibilities, but because the games were already dying. The empire couldn't afford them. The infrastructure that had sustained them for 6 centuries had crumbled, and Christianity had finally achieved enough cultural dominance that moral arguments against the games reinforced economic necessity. Yet the end was incomplete. While gladiatorial combat between humans ceased, the Venetians, wild animal hunts and fights, continued for another century and a half. Christians had fewer moral objections to killing animals than to humans murdering each other, so the beast hunts survived as acceptable entertainment. Chariot racing at the Circus Maximus remained wildly popular throughout the 5th and 6th centuries, demonstrating that Romans still craved spectacle even as specific forms evolved. The Colosseum itself stood empty, no longer filled with 50,000 roaring voices. Without maintenance, the massive structure began deteriorating. Earthquakes damaged walls that were never repaired. When the wind sweeps through the ruined arches of the Colosseum, you can still hear echoes that refuse to fade. The metallic resonance of clashing swords, the thunder of 1,000 feet pounding the ancient steps. Fragments of voices, some roaring for blood, others gasping for mercy. These stones have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the spectacle of triumph and tragedy carved deep into every weathered wall. Beneath the faded marble and sun-bleached travertine, sand once soaked with the hopes and fears of men who fought not just for survival, but for a moment of honor in a world that called them property. Some were slaves dragged to the arena in chains, others volunteers risking everything for fame, all sharing the same uncertain tomorrow. The Colosseum's shadow became both their grave and their legend, the arena where a single heartbeat separated the vanquished from the victorious. Today, as dusk falls and silence reclaims the ruins, the legend endures, a promise written in the dust of centuries. When the wind crosses the ruins of the Colosseum, you can still hear the echo of steel, the crowd's distant cries, and the heartbeat of those who chose to fight, even when the world desired only their slavery. Their story, one of suffering, defiance, and fleeting glory, remains etched in the heart of Rome, a warning, a memory, and perhaps a whisper of what it truly means to be free.